Congresswoman, tell me, what real experience do you actually bring to this chamber? Mitt Romney's voice cut through the air like a sharpened blade, calm yet dripping with condescension. His words didn't just hang in the room. They struck like a hammer, challenging not just Jasmine Crockett's qualifications but her very right to stand there. For a moment, the chamber froze. The question wasn't just procedural, it was personal, laced with the kind of smug dismissal that had silenced countless voices before. Crockett did not rush to answer. She let the silence breathe, let the weight of his words reveal themselves for what they were. Cameras zoomed in, every eye fixed on her. The audience, lawmakers, staffers, journalists, shifted in their seats, expecting perhaps a flustered reply, maybe even a stumble. Romney leaned back, a faint smirk betraying the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Then Jasmine Crockett lifted her gaze, unflinching, her voice steady but edged with fire. "Senator," she said, each word measured, deliberate, "my experience is standing where others once told me I didn't belong, and refusing to move. My experience is fighting for communities that have never had a seat at the table you so easily take for granted. And if you think that doesn't count, maybe it's time you ask yourself what kind of experience really matters here." The words rolled through the chamber like thunder. A murmur rippled across the crowd, staffers exchanging startled looks, journalists scribbling furiously. For a split second, even Romney's face faltered, his polished confidence cracked, his smirk erased. The air was alive, charged with something raw, something undeniable. This wasn't just a response. It was defiance wrapped in dignity, a reminder that experience isn't measured by decades of titles but by the courage to show up where you are unwelcome and to speak when silence is demanded. Crockett's voice didn't just answer Romney, it spoke for every underestimated immigrant child, every woman told to wait her turn, every voter dismissed as unqualified to dream. The chamber had expected a clash. What they got was a revelation. And as Romney shifted in his seat, his silence said more than any rebuttal could. But that was only the beginning. What came next left even Romney stunned. For decades, Mitt Romney had been the embodiment of establishment credibility. To his supporters, he was the seasoned statesman, disciplined, polished, a man who carried the weight of a presidential run and years of political influence. He entered any room with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of authority. And in that chamber, he believed his gravitas alone was enough to tilt the scales. When he questioned Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't just a challenge, it was a declaration of hierarchy, experience over audacity, legacy over new blood. But Crockett was not a politician who bowed to legacy. Her rise was fueled not by inherited networks or decades of privilege, but by the raw determination to speak for people who were tired of being dismissed. She had carried the stories of the overlooked, the immigrants fighting for a foothold, the single parents balancing survival with dreams. Her very presence was proof that fresh voices could carve space where the old guard had once ruled unchallenged. This moment was no longer about one question, it was about two Americas colliding, the America that clung to titles and pedigrees, and the America that demanded to be heard regardless of resume. The air grew thick with anticipation. Lawmakers leaned forward in their seats, sensing that this was no ordinary exchange. Journalists knew the headlines were already writing themselves. Romney, with his practiced authority, represented the expectation that power remains where it has always been. Crockett, with her poise and precision, symbolized the hunger for a new definition of leadership. The contrast was electric, and the stakes were higher than either of them had intended when the words first left Romney's lips. Every camera was rolling, every tweet waiting to be fired, because no one knew what was about to unfold. Outside the chamber, millions of Americans scrolled through feeds, watching clips surface in real time, sharing fragments of Crockett's words with captions that screamed of pride, resistance, and vindication. Inside, the silence was almost unbearable, the kind of silence that always precedes a turning point. Romney's question had been simple, but its echoes reached far beyond Crockett. To progressives, it embodied the arrogance of dismissing newcomers who didn't fit the mold. To those who had ever been underestimated, it was the same question they'd heard in different forms their entire lives: are you qualified enough? Do you belong here? Crockett's presence in that moment transformed a sharp political jab into a test of dignity itself. And she knew it. She understood the stakes were no longer confined to her own credibility. The eyes of millions, immigrants, women, young people carving their first path, were locked on her. They weren't just waiting for her to answer Romney. They were waiting for her to answer on their behalf. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about validation, identity, and the right to exist in spaces that had long been guarded by gatekeepers like Romney. Romney shifted slightly in his chair, perhaps unaware that his words had already ignited something larger than himself. What he had intended as a challenge was becoming a mirror for an entire country's struggle over who gets to claim authority. Crockett's calm defiance was no longer just a reply, it was a warning shot, a signal that the old definitions of experience were about to be rewritten. And in that chamber, under the glare of the cameras, both Romney and the nation braced for the moment that would decide whose voice would define the future. Mitt Romney's name had long carried the weight of establishment power. For decades, he had been the image of the respectable Republican, tall, poised, his voice even and deliberate, the kind of man who always seemed to know the rules because he'd helped write them. From the boardrooms of Bain Capital to the governor's mansion in Massachusetts, and later as the Republican nominee for president, Romney had cultivated a reputation as a man who exuded control. His polished speeches, his sharp suits, his careful diction, everything about him spoke to discipline and pedigree. He wasn't just a politician, he was the embodiment of a political dynasty, even if he hadn't made it to the White House. To many Americans, Romney symbolized a version of politics that was clean-cut, business-minded, and honorable in contrast to the chaos that often defined Washington. He was the man who had spoken about the better angels of conservatism, the one who had at times broken ranks with his party when he believed integrity demanded it. Commentators often labeled him a moral voice in a fractured system. And yet, woven into that carefully crafted image were contradictions that couldn't be ignored. For every moment he stood as a champion of conscience, there was another when opportunism guided his steps. Romney had denounced Donald Trump as a fraud and a danger to democracy, only to later accept Trump's endorsement when political convenience demanded it. He had spoken of bipartisanship but often voted along strict party lines when compromise might have been possible. His career had been a careful dance between principle and ambition, conviction and calculation. And while his supporters praised him as a man of integrity, his critics saw something else, a politician who wore morality like a tailored suit, putting it on and taking it off as the moment required. In the chamber, when he looked at Jasmine Crockett, all of that history seemed to crystallize into a single posture, the posture of superiority. To him, this was not just an exchange of ideas. It was a performance he believed he had already mastered. He had sparred with presidents, debated against political giants, and weathered storms far larger than a freshman congresswoman from Texas. He entered the room expecting deference, perhaps even a bit of awe. After all, to Romney, experience was not just about service, it was about stature, about the accumulation of years that supposedly gave a man the right to question another's worth. And that was the contradiction at the core of his persona. While he often preached humility and civic duty, he carried himself with the air of someone who had been groomed to lead. When he pressed Crockett on her experience, it wasn't framed as an inquiry, it was a dismissal, a reminder that in his world, authority had to be earned the long, traditional way. He underestimated her because he always had the luxury of being overestimated. The villain in this drama wasn't a caricature of malice. Romney wasn't snarling or vicious. He was something subtler, and perhaps more dangerous, the polished gatekeeper who cloaked dismissal in civility. His power lay in the assumption that the hierarchy of politics was fixed, that those who climbed slowly and quietly were the only ones who deserved to stay. Crockett, in his eyes, was a disruption to that order, a bold newcomer daring to claim space that wasn't yet hers to claim. That arrogance, even if dressed in refinement, became the chink in his armor. Because what Romney failed to recognize was that in the new political landscape, pedigree no longer guaranteed dominance. Authenticity carried weight, defiance inspired crowds, and fresh voices resonated more than rehearsed speeches. His superiority wasn't just outdated, it was about to become his downfall. For years, Romney had been accustomed to winning arguments by sheer presence, by the heft of his resume and the gravitas of his delivery. But Crockett was not a politician trained to be polite in the face of condescension. She was forged in fights far more personal, far more visceral. Her voice carried the cadence of people who had been overlooked and underestimated for generations. Romney thought he was engaging in debate, but he was about to step into something larger, a reckoning. He didn't know it yet, but his question would not linger as an indictment of Crockett's experience. Instead, it would boomerang back at him, exposing the cracks in his polished facade. The moment that began as his attempt to remind her of her place would end up reminding the nation that power is never permanent, and respect must be earned anew with every word spoken. Romney thought he had the upper hand, but Crockett was about to turn his own question into a weapon. Jasmine Crockett was never meant to blend quietly into the corridors of power. From the very beginning, her story was one of being underestimated, dismissed, overlooked, told in 100 subtle ways that her voice would never carry as far as those born into privilege. She didn't come from a dynasty, didn't inherit a famous name, didn't have the safety net of generational wealth cushioning her missteps. What she had instead was grit, a relentless sense of duty, and the kind of fire that only grows when you are told, again and again, that you don't belong. Her journey began far from the polished wood and marble of Washington. She came up through communities where politics wasn't a distant spectacle, it was survival. Families like hers lived with the daily consequences of policies crafted by people who never set foot on their streets. From the beginning, Crockett learned that leadership wasn't about titles, it was about listening, standing up, and showing up even when no one believed you could make a difference. She carried that lesson with her like armor, and it forged her into the kind of fighter who didn't wait to be invited into the room, she demanded space in it. Law school wasn't just a path to a career for Crockett, it was an act of defiance. She chose public service over lucrative offers, dedicating her skills to defending the vulnerable. While others chased prestige, she took on cases no one else wanted, representing clients who couldn't afford polished attorneys. She walked into courtrooms where odds were stacked and emerged with victories not measured by headlines but by lives changed. Each case became another reminder, real experience isn't built on appearances, it's carved out in the trenches, where the powerful rarely look. Her rise in public office mirrored that same tenacity. When she ran for office, the skeptics lined up quickly. Too inexperienced, too bold, too unwilling to play by the unwritten rules. They said she was untested, that she would never stand a chance against the polished machinery of establishment politics. But Crockett knew what her critics did not. When you've been underestimated your whole life, you learn to turn doubt into fuel. Her campaign wasn't just about slogans or speeches, it was about showing her community that their voices could reverberate in halls that had long ignored them. And when she won, it wasn't just her victory, it was a declaration that underdogs still had power in America. Her style stood in sharp contrast to Romney's polish. Where he carried himself like a seasoned statesman rehearsed for every camera, Crockett wore her authenticity openly. She didn't cloak her words in layers of calculated civility, she spoke with urgency, conviction, and the raw cadence of lived experience. She didn't pretend to be perfect, she embraced her humanity, and in doing so, reflected the very people she represented. In her presence, voters saw themselves, not an image crafted for approval, but a leader forged by the same struggles they faced every day. And those struggles were never abstract. She knew the exhaustion of working twice as hard for half the recognition. She knew the sting of being talked over in rooms where her ideas were dismissed until repeated by someone else. She knew the weight of systemic inequities pressing against her community and the frustration of promises made by politicians who never returned. These experiences didn't weaken her, they refined her. Every obstacle became proof that her voice carried power precisely because others had tried to silence it. It was this resilience, born from adversity, that Crockett carried with her into that chamber. When Romney questioned her experience, she wasn't just hearing his words, she was hearing echoes of every teacher who doubted her, every interviewer who dismissed her, every rival who assumed she would fold under pressure. His question wasn't new, it was ancient, recycled through generations to keep certain voices at the margins. But Crockett wasn't standing on the margins anymore. She was standing at the center, and she had brought with her the strength of every battle she had already fought and survived. Romney believed that his decades in politics gave him the upper hand, but Crockett's power came from something he couldn't replicate, a lifetime of having to prove her worth in spaces that were never designed for her. She wasn't armed with pedigree, she was armed with purpose. And that purpose made her unshakable. The chamber may have seen a freshman lawmaker facing off against a titan of experience, but beneath the surface, something far more profound was happening. This wasn't the clash of resumes, it was the collision of two different Americas, one polished, privileged, and entrenched, the other raw, resilient, and rising. Crockett represented the future, not because she was perfect, but because she was real. And in that authenticity lay a power Romney couldn't anticipate, let alone silence. Every victory she had earned, every fight she had survived, every underestimation she had turned into triumph, those were her credentials. And they were the very reason his question, meant to diminish her, would become the stage for her most defining moment yet. Little did Romney know, every moment of Crockett's past had prepared her for this exact question. The chamber buzzed with quiet tension as Mitt Romney leaned forward, his gaze sharp, voice steady yet edged with impatience. Congresswoman Crockett, are you suggesting that lived experience can outweigh decades of public service? That the work of seasoned lawmakers carries less weight than passion alone? Each word was deliberate, designed to provoke, to unbalance, to expose what he assumed would be gaps in her preparation. Cameras caught every micro-expression, every tightening of a jaw, every twitch of a hand on the polished desk. The audience felt the weight of history pressing down, expecting the underdog to falter. Crockett's eyes never wavered. Her calmness wasn't hesitation, it was precision. She knew the room was watching, that millions outside were following every syllable. A murmur ran through the chamber as she leaned forward slightly, her voice low but unwavering. Senator, she said, measured, experience is not simply the accumulation of years. Experience is the courage to stand when others would step aside. It's the wisdom earned from engaging with communities that are often invisible to those in power. It's the knowledge that leadership is not inherited, it's earned, moment by moment, decision by decision. Romney shifted, sensing that the usual tools of intimidation were not landing as they once did. His questions, polished and rehearsed, were intended to corner her, to remind everyone that he had navigated far larger stages. Yet Crockett's composure made each jab seem hollow. She didn't rush, she didn't flinch. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, letting every word hang in the air like a challenge to the assumptions that had long governed these halls. The audience, once murmuring with anticipation, now leaned in, collectively holding its breath. As Romney pressed harder, his tone sharpened, tinged with disbelief. So you would have us believe, Congresswoman, that fresh perspective alone can substitute for decades of governance? That enthusiasm can replace the practical knowledge required to legislate effectively? He spoke rapidly now, each phrase a hammer intended to crack her veneer. Close-up shots captured the faint tightening around his eyes, the barely concealed frustration of a man used to command, used to seeing deference in his opponents. But Crockett remained unshaken. She tilted her head, a subtle gesture of focus, her voice steady, controlled. It's not about substitution, Senator, she replied. It's about balance. The experience of many is important, yes, but it cannot overshadow the voices of those who have lived realities that history often ignores. True governance requires listening, adapting, and, yes, being willing to be uncomfortable in the presence of truth. If that seems bold, then so be it. Boldness is not arrogance, it is accountability. The room shifted, the murmurs rising into a ripple of acknowledgement. Even those loyal to Romney's long career could not ignore the undeniable poise with which Crockett dismantled his framing. The contrast was stark, Romney, polished and practiced, teetering on the edge of impatience, Crockett, grounded and authentic, radiating quiet authority. Each glance, each subtle pause, built the suspense, drawing the audience further into the unfolding drama. Romney's usual confidence began to falter as he searched for an opening that Crockett refused to offer. He had overplayed his hand, and now the momentum in the room had shifted. The chamber, the cameras, the nation watching at home, all felt it. The question was no longer whether Crockett could respond, but how she would seize the moment. And then, with one sentence, Crockett flipped the entire exchange upside down. Jasmine Crockett inhaled deeply, the hum of anticipation thick in the chamber, every eye fixed on her. Romney's question had been intended as a knife, but she would turn it into a mirror, reflecting the arrogance of assumption back onto him. Every second mattered. Every syllable carried weight not only for the room but for the millions watching beyond these walls. She let the silence stretch just a moment longer, letting the tension peak, before delivering her first strike. "Senator," she began, her voice calm but resonant, "your question assumes that experience is measured solely in years spent in office, in titles accumulated, in campaigns run. It assumes that those who have faced systemic barriers are somehow less qualified simply because their path has been harder, narrower, or invisible to the polished lens of history." She paused, letting her words settle. The chamber felt it, the subtle shift in energy as the first crack appeared in Romney's armor. He had expected to dominate with authority. Instead, he was confronted with reflection, a challenge to the premise he had long relied upon. Her second strike came with precision. "My experience," she continued, eyes scanning the room, connecting with lawmakers and staff alike, "is forged in the realities that many in this chamber have never known. I have stood in neighborhoods neglected by policy, in schools underfunded, in courtrooms where justice was delayed because the system assumed my community didn't matter. I have fought for the rights of workers, for the safety of children, for the voices that are too often silenced. And I have done it not for accolades, not for headlines, but because leadership demands action where others see inconvenience. That is the experience that prepares a person to legislate with both compassion and conviction." A ripple ran through the chamber. Gasps, quiet murmurs, exchanged glances, her words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending concentric waves of realization across the audience. Romney shifted in his seat, the first visible sign of uncertainty, a faint tightening around the jaw, a glance that flickered with incredulity. For a man so accustomed to control, so accustomed to being the arbiter of credibility, this was unfamiliar terrain. Every word Crockett spoke chipped away at the foundation of assumed superiority he had carried in. She raised the stakes further, layering moral authority atop factual and experiential evidence. Leadership is not a ledger of years or a resume of accomplishments. Leadership is measured by courage, by the willingness to confront inequity when it is inconvenient, to speak truth when it is uncomfortable, and to act when complacency is easy. It is not the accumulation of titles that matters, it is the impact of the choices we make and the lives we change along the way. The chamber was quiet, almost reverent. Even the aides and staffers who had long witnessed political battles seemed momentarily suspended, drawn into the gravity of her argument. And then came the final blow, delivered with the clarity of inevitability. "Experience," she said, her tone rising just enough to carry to the back of the room, "is not defined by age or the number of years behind a desk. It is defined by engagement, by empathy, by courage. Experience is the impact we leave, the justice we advance, the dignity we uphold. If that is too bold a notion for this chamber to accept, then perhaps it is time we redefine what leadership truly means, and whose voices deserve to shape our future." The reaction was immediate and cinematic. Gasps punctuated the silence. Cameras caught Romney's eyes widen, the faint furrow of his brow, the tightening of his hands resting on the desk. His composure, carefully honed over decades, faltered under the weight of her layered rebuttal. His lips parted, searching for words, but none emerged. The chamber was filled with the sound of quiet awe, the subtle shuffle of papers, the half-inhaled breaths of observers, the collective heartbeat of a room held captive by one person's truth. Every beat of the moment was amplified, Crockett's poised delivery, the steady cadence of her voice, the way she held the space without flinching, without raising her tone unnecessarily. Her strength was quiet but undeniable, and it reverberated beyond the walls. Social media, live streams, and breaking clips would later capture this precise sequence, the moment when rhetoric became revelation, when argument became affirmation, when silence itself became a testament. Romney's usual arsenal, experience, polish, reputation, proved insufficient against the authenticity of lived reality articulated with unshakable conviction. For the first time in what seemed like a lifetime of debates, his carefully curated authority failed to dominate. He had underestimated the force of someone who had been trained not by privilege, but by perseverance. His pause was more than hesitation, it was the unmistakable moment when the room recognized a shift in power, subtle but absolute. Crockett allowed herself a fraction of a smile, not of triumph over a single opponent, but of recognition of a larger truth. Her voice, her story, her courage, mattered. And in that microcosm of the chamber, history felt the weight of transformation. Romney, poised and practiced for decades, had been rendered speechless not by aggression, not by theatrics, but by the undeniable moral clarity and layered precision of her argument. The audience remained frozen for a heartbeat longer, suspended between disbelief and admiration. Observers whispered, heads nodded, eyes widened, and the unspoken realization spread, this was a moment they would not forget. The confrontation had evolved into something larger, a statement about identity, about courage, about the meaning of experience in a world often too enamored with titles and tenure. The cameras lingered, capturing every subtle movement, every flicker of emotion on Romney's face, the quiet steadiness in Crockett's posture, the collective tension in the room. It was a tableau of the unexpected, a cinematic snapshot of a political hierarchy being challenged and redefined in real time. The applause, though restrained, began to ripple quietly through corners of the chamber, not as partisanship, but as recognition of courage recognized. Yet Crockett knew the moment was far from over, the real reckoning was just beyond the walls, where millions of viewers would witness, interpret, and share her defiance. The cameras captured Romney's silence, but the real storm was just beginning outside the chamber. The moment Crockett delivered her final words, the chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in a reverent hum of astonishment. Every camera in the room had captured it, the poise, the precision, the moral clarity that left Romney unable to speak. Within seconds, that single exchange had exploded beyond the walls of the Capitol, finding its way into phones, laptops, and screens across the nation. Social media ignited like wildfire. Memes circulated instantly, some exaggerating Romney's stunned expression, others praising Crockett's calm dominance. Hashtags trended within minutes, hashtag speechless, hashtag Crockett Clapback, hashtag experience matters, each one a small digital monument to a moment that resonated far beyond the political sphere. News commentators scrambled to frame the story. Morning shows replayed clips in slow motion, dissecting each inflection, each pause, each calculated word. Opinion pieces splashed across digital platforms, headlines proclaiming a modern David versus Goliath, the young, passionate newcomer standing her ground against a seasoned political titan. Analysts debated what this meant for the future of political discourse, for representation, for the unyielding clash between authenticity and polish. The narrative was clear: Crockett had not just survived the exchange, she had reframed it, redefining what it meant to command respect in a space historically dominated by long-established figures. Public reactions poured in. College students shared the clip on campus forums, praising Crockett's courage and composure. Activists used it to rally communities long ignored, seeing in her a reflection of the fights they had been waging for years. Everyday citizens, scrolling through timelines during lunch breaks or late at night, paused mid-scroll to witness the exchange. Some shared it silently, sending it to friends with a note, "This is what leadership looks like." Others tweeted their admiration, their astonishment, their validation at seeing someone like them, someone unpolished by power, forged instead by struggle, take the stage and claim authority. The ripple effect grew steadily. High school classrooms debated it as a case study in rhetoric and moral courage. Social media influencers highlighted it, offering breakdowns of her argument structure, her strategic pauses, her ability to speak truth to power without losing grace. Even political opponents, while hesitant to praise publicly, couldn't ignore the moment's gravity. Crockett had managed what few could. She had captured the imagination of an audience that stretched far beyond party lines, inspiring those hungry for integrity, empathy, and authenticity in leadership. At the heart of it, the story resonated because it spoke to something universal. People felt it viscerally, the satisfaction of seeing arrogance challenged, the relief of witnessing dignity prevail, the inspiration of understanding that courage could redefine a space that once seemed immovable. Crockett's calm, measured delivery became a symbol of the power inherent in truth and lived experience, a reminder that authority is not simply inherited but demonstrated, moment by moment, word by word. The chamber itself had shifted. Colleagues, both allies and skeptics, exchanged glances that betrayed the same realization as the viewers online: something remarkable had occurred. Romney's silence, once a fleeting moment, now carried the weight of history in microcosm. It was a pause that said more than any rebuttal could. It was the unmistakable sign that a new narrative had begun, one in which courage, authenticity, and moral clarity could rival, even surpass, decades of polish and established power. Yet, even amid the accolades, the trending hashtags, and the viral memes, the story was far from complete. The exchange, electrifying as it was, had set the stage for the deeper lesson Crockett intended to deliver. The nation had seen her dismantle a seasoned titan of politics with a single, masterful rebuttal. They had witnessed her courage, admired her composure, celebrated her intelligence. But there was still one final moment, one last truth she had to impart, a truth that would elevate this encounter from a mere clash of personalities into a resonant lesson about leadership, dignity, and the power of standing firm in one's convictions. The echoes of the chamber faded into the wider world, where social media timelines, news outlets, and public discourse carried the story forward. People debated, shared, and reflected, but beneath it all was a quiet acknowledgement: leadership had just been redefined before their eyes. But Crockett wasn't finished. Her final words transformed a clash into a lesson. The chamber settled into a rare, almost reverent silence as Jasmine Crockett prepared to deliver the final words that would frame the entire encounter. This was no longer a debate about experience, no longer a personal confrontation between two political figures. It was a moment charged with meaning, a chance to turn a clash into a lesson for every observer, every citizen, every person who had ever been underestimated. Crockett's voice, calm yet resonant, began to shape the narrative. "Leadership," she said, eyes sweeping the room, meeting colleagues, staff, and the cameras alike, "is not measured in decades spent behind a desk or in offices of privilege. Leadership is measured by the courage to stand for what is right, even when doing so threatens your comfort, your safety, or the expectations of those who believe they know better. It is measured not by the accumulation of titles, but by the impact we leave on the lives of those who are often unseen, unheard, and underestimated." The chamber absorbed the weight of her words. The contrast was striking. Romney, polished and practiced, embodied years of accumulated authority, yet here stood Crockett, a newcomer whose authority came from a lifetime of resilience, empathy, and moral clarity. She reframed the confrontation not as a battle of resumes, but as a lesson in values: dignity over arrogance, truth over status, courage over complacency. Every pause, every measured inflection reinforced the point, transforming the encounter from political spectacle into moral revelation. Crockett's narrative connected personal struggle with universal principles. She spoke of fairness, recounting how communities long ignored deserved attention, and how leadership required elevating those voices rather than dismissing them. She spoke of equality, emphasizing that opportunity should not be restricted by birthright, wealth, or inherited status, but expanded by courage and commitment. And she spoke of resilience, reminding everyone that the true measure of a person is how they respond to adversity, how they turn obstacles into stepping stones, and how they carry the weight of responsibility without yielding to intimidation. As she continued, her words built an inspirational crescendo. When we measure leadership only by years served, we risk overlooking the people whose lives bear the marks of courage, of sacrifice, and of relentless dedication. We risk believing that authority is something granted by age or title, rather than something earned through action and integrity. True leadership listens, learns, and lifts those around it. True leadership is willing to be uncomfortable, to face challenge with dignity, and to let truth guide every decision. The chamber seemed to hold its collective breath. Even those predisposed to skepticism found themselves drawn in by the resonance of Crockett's argument. Every gesture, every pause, every glance reinforced the message: leadership is not inherited, it is demonstrated; respect is not demanded, it is earned. In that moment, she turned a potentially polarizing exchange into a lesson that transcended politics, touching on values that every audience member, regardless of party, could understand and admire. Crockett's conclusion was quiet but no less powerful. This is not about who has served the longest, nor about who speaks the loudest. It is about who stands firm when standing is difficult, who defends the vulnerable when defending them is inconvenient, and who acts with integrity when acting is risky. It is about transforming adversity into strength, doubt into determination, and underestimation into opportunity. Leadership, at its core, is courage made manifest. As her words hung in the air, the chamber absorbed the lesson fully. Romney, once the embodiment of authority, sat visibly unsettled, a portrait of respect meeting resistance and reflection. The applause that followed was measured but heartfelt, a recognition not of spectacle, but of substance. The lesson was clear, the resonance undeniable: courage, integrity, and authenticity could redefine any space, even one long dominated by tradition and hierarchy. In that chamber, experience was redefined, not by Romney's resume, but by Crockett's courage. The chamber finally exhaled, though the weight of what had just transpired lingered in every corner. Romney remained seated, eyes wide, speechless, the decades of polished authority eclipsed by a single, unwavering response. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett stood tall, composed, embodying the very essence of leadership redefined: courage over pedigree, authenticity over polish, moral clarity over empty bravado. Every camera, every eye, every tweet caught that juxtaposition, freezing it in time as a moment of undeniable significance. Mitt Romney questioned her experience, but Jasmine Crockett's response left not just him, but the entire nation, speechless. What unfolded was more than a debate, it was a lesson in values, a blueprint for what leadership can and should be in a world hungry for justice, fairness, and integrity. It was proof that even the most entrenched power structures can be challenged with conviction, and that one voice, grounded in experience and courage, can resonate louder than decades of polish. And the story doesn't end in that chamber. It extends to every community watching, every individual who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked. It is a call to recognize the power of standing firm, of speaking truth, and of demanding dignity in spaces where arrogance once ruled. If you believe in voices that rise against arrogance, share this story, subscribe, and be part of a movement that demands dignity in American politics. Witnessing courage is not enough, it is the action that follows, the sharing, the amplifying, the standing up for what is right, that ensures moments like this inspire change long after the cameras have gone dark. The legacy of that exchange is not Romney's silence, but Crockett's courage, and it belongs to all of us willing to stand for truth.